I am on. Excellent. And after all that Brexit stuff, now for something completely different. I would like to start by thanking Keir for inviting me to speak again. I was somewhat surprised, as I thought it offended everybody last year. I will try harder this time. The primary motivation behind this talk is to help libertarians ensure that their children have an education that cultivates freedom and minimises the state's malign influence. My ideas are informed by my 17 years in formal education and my 8 years in teaching and private tutoring. The speech is divided into 3 main parts. Firstly, the nature of education. Secondly, schools versus education. And finally, the educational options. So, part 1, hopefully, on here. There we go, part 1. The nature of education. Education can helpfully be defined as the cultivation of an individual's head, hands and heart. The head is man's reasoning faculty, which deals with who, what, why and when. The hands are man's control of his physical body, from the simple art of walking to the painting of a luscious landscape. The heart is man's desires, moral compass and sense of beauty. Whilst it makes some sense to talk of educating families or society, this is only possible if you educate individuals who comprise such groups, since it is only individuals who directly control their own actions. Although I do wonder who is animating Theresa May. To discover why schools are the antithesis of education, we must ask the question, what is the purpose of education? This in turn ultimately depends on the question, what is the purpose of life itself? It seems clear that man's goal is happiness. Whilst what actually constitutes happiness is controversial, we can probably agree on some worthwhile goals which are characteristically constitutive of a flourishing life. They are as follows. First, sufficient wealth. Without external goods of food, clothing and shelter, one's capacity for a good life is significantly diminished. Contra the Stoics, a man trapped at the bottom of a well cannot live a flourishing life. So you must have the appropriate skills to earn a reasonable wage, or typically be married to someone who can. 2. Meaningful work. Even if you were to win the Euro Millions, eventually the mere consumption of even the best art and film, or the most intense experiences of the natural world would be lacking. You would feel you had to do something. Joe Bartley is a case in point. He placed the following advert. Senior citizen, 89, seeks employment in the painting area, 20 hours plus per week, still able to clean, light gardening, DIY and anything. I have references. Old soldier, airborne forces. Save me from dying of boredom. Meaningful work not only requires skills that the market or household desires, but also some reflection upon what sort of work is in fact valuable. Although this does not necessarily imply following your dream, since most of us will work for the majority of our waking hours, knowing that our toil has some significant value will aid our happiness, which is why you should never become Brexit Secretary. 3. Community. As well as being a rational animal, man is also a social animal. We like nothing more than talking with others who are as enthused about a topic as we are, be it the evils of the EU or the greatness of Game of Thrones. Controversial, I see. Community requires that we are individuals whom people wish to spend time with, otherwise we could be effectively ostracised. Secondly, community requires that we understand the nature of our particular existing community. In our case, that is, we are immersed within the history and traditions of England and the Western Christian tradition more generally. 4. Marriage. The most basic and most important form of community is the family, which is typically created by marriage. Over 90% of people will be married at some point in their lives, and the natural orientation of marriage is the begetting of children. Having a stable family life is strongly correlated to happiness on self-reported studies. Consequently, we should cultivate a marriageable disposition and develop desirous traits of a husband and father, or wife and mother, as well as recognise these virtues in others. If he had, Paul McCartney would be a lot richer. Never remember that one? Definitely not. You think he lost 23 million out of that?
What about Jeff Bezos?
Oh, yes, as well. Yes, good old Jeff, yes. Finally, we should recognise each child as a unique individual and tailor their education as much as is practically possible. We are not educating humanity, but living, breathing children. So, part 2. Schools versus education. For the purposes of this speech, a school will be defined as follows: an institution where there is an extensive, common academic curriculum, rigid age segregation, and almost permanent adult supervision. Whilst this definition may be somewhat idiosyncratic, it is true of the vast majority of what we would ordinarily consider schools. Now, while some children do gain much from state and private schools, they would likely have flourished all the more if they would have been educated otherwise. So, 2A. Schools have failed on wealth acquisition and meaningful work. According to a survey of 400 graduate employers, only 1/3 believed that university adequately prepared students for work in their organisation. Now, this is university graduates who you would think were the cream of the schooling crop. So why have schools failed? Firstly, the extensive common academic curriculum entirely misunderstands how people in fact learn. People learn best when they have an intrinsic interest in a subject. For example, if you are a nature lover, you will learn additional facts about the sociality of wildcats much more readily than the first 100 prime numbers. Now, it is true, if you allow children to solely follow their own interests, especially at a younger age, they would likely spend much of their time shooting aliens on the Xbox or continually re-watching the Minions movie. However, this does not justify subordinating most of the child's waking hours to a prescribed curriculum. To be a mature person, you need to be able to have time to yourself, to experiment and to fail. Under schooling, most of your time is supervised by adults. You are not allowed to go out on your own to experience cities, towns, or even woods these days. It guts the resourcefulness of children to sort out their own problems. And it produces a dependency mentality, which creates compliant corporate cogs. This is a particular hindrance to the development of boys who thrive on initiative and the challenges of the external world. Is it then surprising that over 1/3 of employers say that graduates lack resilience and have a dearth of self-management skills? Further, the curriculum content, especially in the state's ubiquitous GCSE and A levels, is at best questionable. Now, this does not just include ridiculous GCSE maths questions about the lives of Sanjeet, Sunita and Mohammed. If you've seen the questions, you know this is true. But also the infection of climate change hysteria, feminist literary criticism, and Keynesianism. To pass A-level macroeconomics requires the regurgitation of complete and utter nonsense. Moreover, I've worked in both state and private sixth form colleges. And the greater majority of teachers I know are at best left of centre. A few years ago, the head of a large private sixth form wore a Hillary 2016 t-shirt at an A-level examination meeting. Fortunately, that hasn't aged well. Whilst most teachers claim to be neutral, their political beliefs will impact their teaching in some form. Further, both state and private schools must now promote British values. Now, we're all familiar with these, I hope. But maybe not. Either way, I wouldn't be surprised in the near future that libertarianism is suppressed under British values under the auspices of challenging far-right extremism. Because the whole point was the sort of counter-extremism thing, which basically meant disagreeing with the government. So, second to intrinsic interest, people learn best when they see that the new knowledge or skill acquired will achieve a goal that is meaningful to them. For example, improving your cardiovascular capacity so you can become a professional sprinter. Many children at secondary school ask the teacher, "Why do we need to learn Pythagoras?" He replies, "Well, because it's on the exam." However, calculating the length of the longest side of a triangle bears little relation to actual tasks performed in most jobs, so the children find it of little value. If schools had much more vocational content, then the link between learning and the desired future employment would be much closer. However, learning a trade in the classroom is like cultivating honesty in the House of Commons. Ideally, you want to learn in the context in which you will act. This is one of the reasons that training outside your normal workplace is generally useless, because your learning is decontextualized. For example, learning basic memory techniques to remember the contents of a box in an air-conditioned room is perfectly fine, but is of little use when recalling complex processes in a humid workshop. People want to see the practical end of their training, which cannot be adequately copied outside a business setting, since the crucial goal of satisfying the consumer is missing. If a child is interested in a trade, the best way for them to learn is to be apprenticed to a skilled tradesman. After a number of years, they can then leave and work independently. In this world, we might actually have 20-year-olds who are financially independent, rather than moving back in with mum and dad after graduation. Since most of the school curriculum is neither of intrinsic interest nor of obvious use to students, they associate study with boredom and pointless toil, which can reinforce an anti-learning disposition for the rest of their lives and possibly then reduce their earning potential. 2b. Schooling has failed on community and marriage. Schooling is also an anathema to the creation of genuine community. In any peer group, naturally recognised leaders emerge. In traditional cultures, this tends to be the tribe's elders who have a great experience and wisdom cultivated throughout their lives. In schooling, however, everyone is split into narrow age groups, and socialisation between age groups tends to be limited. Consequently, peer group leaders will be a very similar age to the child in question, and by virtue of their age are immature at best, thus reinforcing the bad habits of youth. In contrast, people in the real world interact with vastly different ages, whether it's at the pub, in church, or at work. Further, the gospel of multiculturalism means that the child will typically learn a very jaundiced view of English history, thereby aiding his deracination. There is also a significant increase in alleged sexual offences committed by pupils in schools. I am, though, dubious of these figures, since many of these infractions are sexual harassment, which is about as well defined as my abs. I have got a great six-pack. Yet, the increase in reporting does suggest that the relationship between sexes in many schools is far from harmonious. Also, sex education focuses mostly on safe sex and how to avoid the newest and latest STDs, rather than cultivating the virtues of a good spouse. Further, the Equality Act of 2010 not only prevents teaching marriage as the norm, but also compels the teaching of alternative lifestyles. In 2017, Ofsted failed the private Vishnitz Girls' School for the third consecutive time for refusing to teach homosexuality and transsexualism to 6-year-olds. So, what is to be done about schools? On a political level, the major goal should be the abolition of child labour laws, compulsory school attendance laws, and the Equality Act. This would liberate children from state indoctrination, allow them to learn and work as their parents pleased, and would likely decrease the age segregation in society. Part 3, the educational options. But what can be done in our own lives to improve the education of our children? Whilst there are some worthy school-like organisations, they tend to be seriously deficient in some way. The best example would be the democratic free schools pioneered by A.S. Neal at Summerhill. It grants the child a great amount of freedom to direct his own learning, but would allow him to spend all his years in the local woods if he so pleased. They also instill an absurd democratic mindset. Most of the major decisions regarding school rules are made in the daily school meeting. in which every member of staff and child each have one vote. Therefore, given the current circumstances, the best vehicle for education is in fact home education. Now, I am biased, as my wife and I home educate our 4 children, but I genuinely believe this to be the case. So now here's some ubiquitous pictures. Here is Zachary, he's the eldest, he's 6. There's Talia, she's 3. And twin brother, Glory, who's 4. Then we've got the youngest, he's Ptolemy, not the Egyptian emperor. Well, not yet anyway. And this, of course, is my wife. And this is what she looks like underneath. So, the current educational law is one of the most liberal in the Western world. Home educating families are not required to register with any government agency, and so can educate their children without state permission. However, the Department of Education is currently attempting to introduce a mandatory register, and Clive Soley's bill intends to impose routine monitoring. At present, however, the only situation in which the local education authority can intervene is if they believe a child is not receiving a suitable education. Crucially, however, they can't use routine monitoring to acquire this information. Only if they have evidence otherwise obtained can they investigate a family. So, essentially, if you are never within the state or private school system, you will be left alone to teach your children any subject in any manner you deem appropriate. If you do register from school entirely, the local education authority will know you home educate, but they still cannot routinely monitor you, although some erroneously believe they have the legal power to do so. I believe Westminster Council is particularly bad in that respect. But why should you home educate? A good education requires the golden mean of form and freedom. Sufficient guided activity to capture the child's imagination with stimulating material, but also plenty of time to follow their own interests. So, 3. Home education succeeds at wealth acquisition and meaningful work. As a home educator, you can tutor your children in the riches of English and European history. Learn Anglo-Saxon history from Bede himself, listen to the Western musical canon from medieval chant to romantic symphonies, read great literature from Greek myths to novels of Gene Wolfe. Understand history as a historical discovery process rather than an unquestionable set of propositions. Grapple with classical metaphysics and modern epistemology. With the internet, all this material is a click away. No longer do you need to traipse around obscure, dusty, second-hand bookshops to buy what you need. Whilst pursuing their own interests, your children can naturally learn reading, writing, arithmetic, and basic computer competence, the skills required to function in today's marketplace. Suppose your son is enamoured with Manchester United. Player stats naturally lend themselves to basic maths, and learning about the history of the club encourages reading. It can also lead to varied topics such as geography and even physics. For example, learning why the snow on the plane's wings caused the Munich air disaster in 1958. Following one's interests can lead to unexpected places, which can be a catalyst for a future career. Also, home education allows those more practically inclined to spend ample time developing their mastery of baking, woodworking, or coding. Further, where prudent, home-educated children can sit GCSE and A-levels as external candidates to improve their employability or university applications. Further, by allowing children to direct much of their own study and activities, it gives them responsibility and control to divest their time as they see fit, to try new things, to fail, and discover goals which they find meaningful. So I believe they are more likely than school leavers to be employed in an occupation they find meaningful. They are also likely to be more self-motivated, so if they need to train for a particular career, they will more easily set their minds to it. In addition, self-direction allows children to learn at their own speed. For example, my son Zachary, who we saw just before, loves maths and already studies some GCSE material. At most schools, this could only be possible with an additional extra class, which would likely cultivate an aversion to more advanced maths, as it just increases his workload. This happened to my wife at GCSE maths. She had to stay after school so she could learn the material for the higher paper, since the teacher only covered the intermediate content in class. Hence, a common curriculum typically punishes those who are significantly above average. Home education also allows you the freedom to leave study and explore castles, museums and stately homes on a regular basis, to experience things firsthand rather than just relying on books. As part of Zachary's ancient studies, I intend to take him to the British Museum to encounter the Assyrian cherubs and Rosetta Stone in person. Another really dry bit. It's like speaking in the Sahara Desert. Another benefit of home education is that your children freely roam. I live near extensive woods and parks, which are ideal for children to explore unsupervised. They need their own space to do as they please, knowing that an adult will not always be there to solve their problems. Thereby cultivating independence. This is especially important for boys, as they typically crave autonomy. Locking them inside for hours seriously stunts their development. Thus, home educated children can learn at their own speed, specialise from a young age, as well as cultivating independence and responsibility, all of which will improve their earning potential. 3B. Home education succeeds at community and marriage. Home education can also socialise children far better than age-segregated schools. The children interact with people of all ages, from younger siblings to grandparents. They also interact with a wide range of people, from museum curators to zookeepers. This cultivates their manners and makes them more comfortable within groups of diverse ages and backgrounds. There are also many regular meetups with home educating families. Now, whilst many families are similarly minded, there are differing reasons why people home educate, so you meet all types. So I've met quite a few hippies and even some survivalists. So they're genuinely, yeah, I've come across one. It's slightly strange, but not judging. So, it's true your children could be able to have more friends at school, but how many would be genuine friends? In most cases, it's only possible to have deep friendships with a relatively small number of people. Within home education, the socialisation would be much more voluntary in nature, so I expect the relationship between the sexes to be significantly less fraught than in school. Further, you can encourage your teenagers to reflect upon what would make a good spouse without the absurd expectations that school peer groups can bring. For example, if at the age of 13 you're not in a relationship, then there's something wrong with you. 3C, objections to home education. Now, you may be thinking, this all sounds wonderful if you have the ability to teach these subjects, but most parents do not. However, if you look at the GCSE syllabuses for most subjects, with the exception of languages and maths, the difficulty level simply isn't that high. Most reasonably intelligent adults could train themselves to pass these exams by reading the appropriate textbooks and mark schemes. One guy I know, who isn't particularly academic, told me that as an adult he taught himself the entirety of GCSE law in several hours. Further, if you do struggle with some topics, you can always find a private tutor. Type coupon code MISESUK at checkout for 20% off my economics tuition. Moreover, with Skype tutoring online, you can usually find a tutor in most subjects and at a reasonable price. Another potential problem for home education is a significant lack of masculine input. Since it is the mother who typically does most of the educating, boys especially can miss out on male influence, particularly in their teen years. That said, the vast majority of teachers are female, so it's not likely that this would be rectified in the typical school environment. My move from teaching to private tutoring was partially motivated by a desire to be more actively involved in the children's education. Also, home education can be expensive, particularly in terms of opportunity cost, as it typically means one parent cannot work in the marketplace. However, coordination with other families or family members can facilitate some extra part-time work. Also, the internet provides inexpensive access to a glorious array of worksheets, videos and books. Further, compared to private schooling, home education is actually very reasonable. The average day school fees are now about £17,000 per pupil per year. So if you have, and this is for day school, not boarding. If you have 2 children, their mother would need to earn just under £45,000 a year before tax just to cover the £34,000 a year in school fees. So, 3E, home educate yourself. The final reason to home educate is that it is good for you as parents. What can be more meaningful than educating your own children to lay the groundwork for a flourishing existence? You can also learn all the things you wanted to learn but were never taught. Unless you have a particularly interesting job, it is unlikely you'll find much else as rewarding. This is particularly true for most women, as they tend to gravitate towards occupations which revolve around human interaction, and also disproportionately work in boring, low-paid jobs. Conclusion. Given the current circumstances, home education is the best option for our children, especially because of the legally compelled worship of equality and diversity, and the mandatory promotion of British values in all state and private schools. Such compulsion will inevitably extend to other subjects within school, to increase the state's control of children's minds. The family and other civil institutions, such as churches, must be stripped of their power, until all individuals become atomised individuals, dependent on the state and the state alone. Home education, on the other hand, increases the heft of the family as an alternative institution to the state. Finally, it can also be a vehicle for libertarian and conservative families to network with each other to build a credible community. Within a genuine, robust community, we can stand together against the state, and the future of liberty may not be so dim. Thank you.
Short coffee break, then back for the last talk in the panel.
That was wonderful.
Am I next? You're going, are you?